We are now moving to the next short session. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pavan Sukhdev. So please, if you can take the stage. And we give people, when they come up on stage, a big applause, I think. I mean, it's... Dr. Sukhdev, this is going to be very exciting. As you know, you are the link now between science and policy, even if not least Ms. Narayan has really moved us in that direction. You are from Yale University, and you have been a special advisor and head of UNEP's Green Economy Initiative, which of course is something trying to set the stage for real. What is actually also interesting, and many people will know that of course, is that you are a career banker. So you know what economy is all about, but still, you would like also to see changes. So please, the floor is yours, and you are now being linked to the high-level panel also, which will follow. So please.
Okay. Well, thanks, Johan, for putting me in this daunting position between an array of Nobel laureates and an array of UN specialists. And a banker is supposed to bridge between. It's unreal. But let me begin by saying maybe not that bad an idea, because economics is the currency of policy. And the science, especially the science that all of you brought to the table, is really the foundation and the boundary for economics. Because economics floating in thin air, as sometimes it tends to do, is not a good idea. Economics grounded in reality of societies, of people, and of the limits of this planet is good economics. I want to talk a bit about some of the challenge that is brought to the table because of the economic invisibility of perhaps development's biggest asset, and that is nature. Nature provides not just the food, fuel, fiber, and clean air and fresh water that we need as members of a rich community, but it also provides the basic sustenance for the poor. Nutrients and fresh water flows from the forests to the farms of poor farmers are absolutely essential for their well-being and for their survival. And these are the aspects of nature which, unfortunately, just do not hit the compass. Sunita spoke, as she left, about GDP as our unfortunate compass, but unfortunate because it's not sufficient. It doesn't capture poverty the way it should. It does not capture nature the way it should. And the project that I was leading for some time on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity tried to capture that economic invisibility. And did so by collecting a lot of information from very many researchers around the world, but attaching values to the so-called ecosystem services. And let me just give you two examples of what it does when you start using economics as the currency of policy, and when you start using good science as the basis or the foundation for economics. Here's an example from Uganda. This is a picture of a wetland called the Nakivubo Swamp. And at one point in time, the city of Kampala had decided to dam over this swamp so that it would create something like another 40 square kilometers of space, which would be used for agriculture development and so on. And that decision would have been carried forward until an economist pointed out that this swamp, with all its pestilence and mosquitoes, was actually the sewage treatment facility for the city of Kampala. And the value of the sewage treatment that this provided by breaking up human excrement and converting it into food for fish, basically, that value was almost $2 million per year. And when the economics worked out, it showed that, in fact, the value of creating that additional farmland and subtracting the costs of that conversion and subtracting the loss of livelihoods for fisher folks and so on, that was actually less than 1/8 of the value that was already being provided for free by the Nakivubo Swamp. The swamp was protected. It's now part of the green belt. Good use of basic science understanding, economics around that science, and influencing local policy. Another example, and this one is from Japan. The white stork, a creature much loved by the Japanese and close to their psyche and to their sense of well-being, was extinct in the western coast of Japan, and in fact pretty much all of Japan, in Honshu Island, in Toyooka City. They reintroduced some breeding pairs, but to really make them survive, they had to change farming methods back to the old methods of organic farming, which they did on almost 200 hectares from close to nothing. So with those change in farming methods, you found that the stork, which was extinct in 1971, has actually come back. I've actually visited this place, so this is not a fiction. I've actually seen 2 of the 40 breeding pairs. And the good news is that, again, it was the economics that justified this, apart from the attachment of the people to this talk, because as a result of this, you're getting almost $10 million worth of additional tourism into that location. You're getting farmers producing so-called white stalk rice, which basically sells 20 to 50% higher in price. And there is an increase in revenues for the local prefecture of about 1.4%, which doesn't sound very high, unless you know what Japan is like, and it has been for the last 20 years. 1.4% is huge in economic terms. Now, this whole problem of economic invisibility has something to do and has a deep connection with business. How many people in this room are from the business world? Can I have a show of hands? Okay, so what I'm saying here with an example of a shrimp business may not be your business, I'm sorry, but it illustrates the point, and then I'll come to a bigger point. In southern Thailand, the conversion of mangrove swamps, again, pestilential, horrible places, so it seems, into shrimp farming has been going on for over 3 decades. And the rationale is profits and jobs. So here's the comparison. If you look at a hectare of mangrove forest converted to shrimp farm, the value of that in terms of the present value of the shrimp output, profits of the firm, are basically about $9,600, compared to just a mere $600 if you left the mangrove to provide fuel wood for the poor communities who live nearby. But when you recalculate after excluding subsidies which are being provided to the shrimp farmers, then the comparison is not that hot, because then you're talking about $1,200 versus $600. But in fact, that's not the full picture. Because if you start accounting for the cost of restoring that land, because after 4 or 5 years, typically salt deposition and chemical deposition makes it unusable even for shrimp farming, and you have to put it back into normal state. That's about minus $12,000. And if you count the value of the mangrove forest in terms of coastal defense and in terms of providing fisheries for the local fisher folk, because mangroves are the nursery of fish, then you've got a positive 10,000. So look at the comparison. If you look at total wealth and not just private profits, in other words, if you look at public wealth and not just private wealth, the trade-off choice is completely the opposite of what you would have made. And that's the key point. I think many of you in the panel had raised this issue about how wicked this problem is of markets working basically just for private goods and not for public goods. And here's an example of what that does. Now, is this just a little story out of South Thailand, which doesn't matter to the remaining 200 of you who are here in business? I'm sorry, that's not the case. Because a study was done recently which worked out the so-called externalities, in other words, the cost to society of doing business as usual. And the total cost externalities of the top 3,000 listed corporations around the world worked out to something quite staggering, something like $2.2 trillion US. Well, that's about 3.5% of global GDP. And a lot of this came in terms of the climate-changing emissions of these companies. Some of it came in terms of fresh water, some in terms of the cost of pollutants, health costs, and so on and so forth. But these are basically legal operations of firms doing business as usual, creating third-party costs in society. It is these costs that really need to be calculated. Right now, we don't really do that except in these one-off exercises. In addition to these impacts that businesses have on nature, which is, as I mentioned, the foundation, the basic infrastructure of development, there are, of course, opportunities for business. And here's just a list, a kind of list in alphabetical order, for no other reason, of all of the types of businesses which involve and use nature as an asset, as a productive asset, whether it is ecotourism or whether it is hydroelectricity generation. These are all nature-based businesses, so we need to recognize the importance of nature in each of these sectors. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. There are, thankfully, good news. There's thankfully some good news on this account, because in recognizing the need for change and recognizing the importance of greening the global economy, in terms of greening, I mean improved distribution of wealth, an increase in well-being, a reduction in ecological scarcity, and a reduction in environmental risks, including climate risk. There are lots of success stories that we can find in terms of the product innovation that's been going on, whether it's micro-irrigation in water or buildings, energy efficiency, or manufacturing. Caterpillar's been remanufacturing a lot, or renewables for that matter. And we find that with the success of product innovation, together with that, there is the success of sales, and there is a huge amount of increase that we see in terms of certified forest products, almost increased fourfold over the last 5 years, of organic foods, that is a threefold increase over the last 10 years, and indeed of fisheries. In just over the last 2 years, we've seen an increase of about 70%. The certified fisheries is now almost a $2 billion total turnover. And here are some of the examples of what you're finding in terms of the companies who are taking leadership: Mars, Cadbury, Kraft, Unilever. These are top names around the world. Green economy success stories are there if you look at the initiatives that have been taken in most of the cases by developing nations. That's interesting, because very often you hear of green economy and the concept of reducing all these impacts and improving equity and improving well-being. You think of that as rich world, but it's not. It's actually developing world. And that brings us to the question of what business can do. And business can actually do a lot. We can engage society. We can work towards going net neutral, as it has been done in many cases. We can develop management capacity to measure and manage our impact. We can begin to integrate other sections of society. And we can also ask governments to do certain things, and these are not small. So we can ask governments to do certain things, which I've listed here, and in fact, these have been absorbed by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Most importantly, I think we need to ask governments to get the metrics right, because today we are looking at something that we are not comfortable with. I think broadly, going beyond GDP has been mentioned several times, including by the panel preceding. It is not really going to work if we keep looking at the wrong metrics. We have to measure what we want to manage. And if we want to manage human well-being, and if we want to manage happiness, we need to at least make a few steps in the right direction. We can't keep continuing to measure GDP growth as the sole and most important signal of economic performance. We can't keep measuring quarterly profits as the sole and only measure of corporate performance. Neither of these things really are true reflectors of well-being in society, which is the end game. Why then is the corporation, which is the largest economic agent, 75% of GDP, 70-odd% of employment, why is it using a metric that clearly does not reflect its value to society? Why are governments using a metric that don't reflect their actions? We need to move away, and I very much hope that with your help and with the collaboration that we have with the panel that follows, the green economy and the ideas of proper measurement will land squarely and fairly on Rio+20. Thank you very much.
Thank you.